This week on the Hollywood in Toto podcast, we find out why George Clooney is more partisan than patriot. And we talk to the most dangerous comedian around, Josh Denny. Why is he so dangerous? Well, he uses words and thoughts. It's complicated. He's been canceled, but we'll share much more in a minute.
Welcome to the Hollywood in Toto podcast. Entertainment news and reviews without the woke Hollywood narrative. Free speech, free expression. Now that's entertainment. And here's your host, award-winning film critic, Christian Toto.
Before we kick things off, I hope you'll subscribe to the Hollywood in Toto podcast. You can find us on YouTube, Rumble, and of course, iTunes or your favorite podcast provider. Keep supporting the show. Thank you so much for checking it out. And also, this transition to video has been interesting for me. It's certainly a learning lesson. I am growing each week. I think you can see some of the growing pains, but I really appreciate how many people are checking out the show. It means a lot to me. And yes, the best is yet to come. George Clooney has spoken. Now, why do we have to listen again? The Oscar winner came out this week with an op-ed in the New York Times saying Joe must go. I guess he's no longer riding with Biden. Why does he have to go? Well, we all know why Joe has to go. He's not well. He's suffering some age-related situation that we've yet to determine, but we all have a pretty good idea what's going on. It's not good. So why George Clooney is raising his voice now? Well, that's a very good question. Of course, now it's safe to raise your voice about Joe Biden because for a long time, you couldn't talk about it. You couldn't explain all the video clips and all the instances where the president, the commander-in-chief, couldn't put two words together.
I'll beat Donald Trump. I will beat him again in 2020.
It was a cheap fake. It was a deep fake. It was misdirection. It was fake news. Now we all know it's just the sad truth. That's all. Now, the context here is fascinating. George Clooney appeared with Joe Biden just a few weeks ago. A very expensive fundraiser raised a lot of money for Joe Biden's campaign. And at the time, George Clooney said nothing. Didn't wave the red flag, didn't warn us about what was going on behind the scenes, didn't say, oh my gosh, the commander-in-chief is not well. He pretended everything was normal. Nothing to see here, folks. Move along. But now, post-debate, post that disastrous George Stephanopoulos interview, now it's time for liberals to speak, to say, hey, it may be time to switch out our presidential candidate because this guy is not doing well.
Did you ever watch the debate afterwards?
I don't think I did, no.
A little late, isn't it? I mean, we could have told you this weeks and weeks ago, months and months ago. You could say years and years ago. So why now? Why is George Clooney speaking up now? Well, you could be conspiratorial and say that Obama made him do it. There's certainly whispers about that. I'm not going to go there. We don't know anything about it. It doesn't matter. But the bottom line is it is now safe to say Joe must go. It looks like Trump will win in November just based on current polling and trends. And now we can say what hasn't been said for so long, that Joe is suffering an age-related situation that makes him incapable of serving 4 more years. Well, George, why now? Why didn't you say this immediately? If you were a true patriot, you would have raised the alarm instantly. You saw up close why President Biden is no longer well. And you didn't. You waited till now. That's pure politics. And it sure is ugly. I have to take a quick step back. I have a George Clooney story to share with you. Years ago, I was at the junket for the movie The Perfect Storm. This is when George Clooney was transitioning from the ER heartthrob into a major movie star. Obviously, that transition worked out pretty well for him. He's got an Oscar. But at the time, he was giving press interviews and talking to different journalists, and I was one of them. We're part of these roundtable groups where people get together. The actor comes in the room, you talk to them, and then a new actor comes in a little while later, and then you talk to them. It's a very productive way to get a lot of different interviews out of a single day. And at the end of that day, I was walking back to my hotel, and I saw Clooney He was ducking into his trailer. And this is not really like me. I'm not really an aggressive person, but I went up to him. I started chatting him up. I don't know why, what came over me, but I just wanted to do it. And he could have been like, hey, beat it, Scram. I already talked to the press. Get out of here. But no, George Clooney was actually very cool. We had a good conversation. He talked about how he's looking forward to his next movie project, which was Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? And it was a good exchange. And I've always had kind of a warm feeling about George Clooney from that because, again, he could have told me to beat it and he would have been well within his rights. George Clooney's a smart fellow. He's a producer. He's a director. His career has ebbed and flowed. He's not as popular as he once was. He's always been political. He's always been on the left. But he did us wrong here. And he's not alone, of course. Many, many people did us wrong, too. Stephen Colbert, Jimmy Kimmel. These people were up close and personal with President Biden, and they didn't sound the alarm. Now, George Clooney is doing just that. Now, Stephen Colbert is doing just that from his pulpit on CBS.
I think that Biden debated as well as Abraham Lincoln. If you dug him up right now.
So lots of questions here. Why didn't George Clooney do the right thing right away? Why do we even care about George Clooney in the first place? Many people have seen President Biden up close over the last few months. Many people are now talking about how discombobulated he is, how confused he looks, how just old and weak he seems. All of a sudden, we can all speak up about it. We can all talk about it. We can all admit it. If George Clooney was a true patriot, he would have said so right away. He would have raised his hands and said, you know what? I know it's not a popular opinion, but I've seen the president up close, and something is deeply wrong here. He didn't do it. I always have a soft spot in my heart for George Clooney. He was good to me. I think he's a good actor. I like the projects he picks. I think he's an interesting fellow. I think he's not trying to do cookie cutter stories. I think we need more talent like him in Hollywood. But you know what? We need more talent in Hollywood, if they're going to go political, to tell us the truth, to shoot straight, to raise the alarm when it should be raised, not well past its expiration date. George Clooney, you didn't do the right thing this time around. I hope you've learned your lesson, and I hope we've learned our lesson, maybe to take what a celebrity says about politics with a grain of salt. Maybe less than that. A news story from a couple of years ago really caught my eye then, and I really haven't forgotten it since. The story followed different comedians who were having trouble telling jokes in a comedy club. It seems that they are edgy. They're different than your typical comedian. They don't tell all the approved jokes. They don't share all the punchlines that they're allowed to say. They break the rules. They do the Lenny Bruce thing, which is saying what they want to say. Once upon a time, that was cool, hip, irreverent, necessary. Now, well, you know it's not. At least it's frowned upon in certain circles. I'm talking about Josh Denny. He was a comedian who, when he wanted to go play a comedy club, he couldn't just say, hey, I'm going to be at Funny Bones or the Laugh Factory next week. He'd have to send out messages to his social media following and be a bit cryptic about it. I'll be in Baltimore next week. Stay tuned. Well, why would he do that? Is he trying to create some sort of false sense of excitement? Not really. He was doing it because whenever he would announce a club, an Antifa-like mob would rise up and they would put pressure on that particular venue and say, hey, we don't want you having Josh Denny at this club. And sometimes the pressure would work and they would cancel him. Cancel him for jokes. Cancel him for jokes he hasn't even told yet. This is what Josh Denny would go through just to be able to work at a comedy club and to share his art with the public. Now, we're going to catch up with Josh Denny in just a minute, but I just wanted to give that background because it does matter. It is important, and it's rather shocking. It's also the kind of story you think would get lots and lots of coverage. But the story I read was on Tucker Carlson. How many other people have reported on it? I'd say very few, if any. That's a huge story. Comedians can't tell the jokes they want to tell. Comedians being blocked from using their First Amendment right. Comedians being threatened, venues being threatened. Wow, stop the presses. Well, not these presses. The press no longer works like that. But you know what? I'm an independent journalist. I can talk to Josh Denny. I don't have to agree with every joke he shares. I could say maybe he crossed the line here or there. That's what we're all about. You watch a show, you laugh, you don't laugh. You go see a club performer, you don't see a club performer. It's simple, right? Well, not so much. Well, Josh Denny is just doing his own thing still. He's on Patreon, he's on podcasts, he has a YouTube channel, and on that YouTube channel, you can watch his new comedy special. It's called The Goliath, and he's telling jokes again you won't hear anywhere else. I'm talking Shane Gillis, Ryan Long, maybe even Joe Rogan. They don't dig as deeply as Josh Denny does. They don't probe uncomfortable areas quite like he does. And sometimes it's very funny, and sometimes it's rude, and sometimes you'll be shocked by what he has to say. But he's saying it on his terms. You don't like it, don't watch. But clearly, enough people do for him to continue his comedy career. And thank goodness for that. I don't have to agree with every comedian. I don't have to laugh at every joke. But shouldn't a comedian be able to go out there and have a living and tell jokes without fear of repercussions? So I haven't talked to Josh in a while. We've chatted in the past, and I wanted to catch up with him, talk more about his special Goliath, find out if he's still having to create his career in a way where he avoids specific club dates, specific venues until the last minute. I'm fascinated by that. It's something that should be talked about, and we're going to do it here because that's what we do at the Hollywood and Toto podcast. So I hope you'll enjoy my conversation with Josh Denny, a smart guy, a bold guy, a guy who doesn't follow the rules, a guy who blazes his own trail. Love him or hate him, he is a unique individual. And like I said at the beginning, he might be the most dangerous comedian in Hollywood right now. Take a listen. Well, Josh, thanks for joining the show. You know, I read a story about you a couple of years ago that really shocked me, and it didn't get nearly enough coverage. And it talked about how when you go out to tell jokes, you have to do it in a very specific way where you basically tease the city on social media, don't give instructions or details. And then it gets closer to the showtime. You give those details out to prevent cancellation, Antifa-like mobs kind of trying to threaten the venue, things like that. Is that still happening with you right now? Has that situation improved at all?
Well, it's been happening less. Part of it is because as I've taken on more aspects of the booking process myself to where I'm writing contracts and everything else. I've done a pretty good job over the last year of being very direct with the venues and saying, hey, this could happen, but we're going to sign a deal that basically says if it does and you cave to it, you have to pay us back all of the ticket losses. So I've kind of lawyered my way around having to do it, but I don't know. I mean, I'd have to really see. I mean, that was really hot because I was on the road with Gavin McInnes and Anthony Cumia, and obviously Gavin, having been the founder of the Proud Boys, former leader of the Proud Boys, that comes with its own sort of stigma attached, which made it a lot hotter, you know, when it would come to the political pressure that would be put on these venues. But I don't know. There's also an element of kind of fun and cool to it as well, to, you know, keep it secret until the day of the show. So I don't know that, you know, I wish I could say I invented that. I was certainly not the first comedian to come up with that idea. And, but I think it's unfortunate how necessary it's become sometimes. And I don't know if you saw this story, but there was a comedy club in Portland a few months back who had canceled a bunch of comedians from pressure from like their local Antifa and LGBTQ people. And, you know, there were folks like Jim Florentine and Louis J. Gomez who are, you know, hardly divisive political figures at all. They're just, you know, funny comedians.
Yeah. I think Dave Smith might have been one of them. Again,
Dave was one of them.
A pretty respectable fellow. I mean, before any single joke was told, they were canceled. It was a fascinating story. I did cover that a few months back. You know, when you talk to these venue operators, I mean, they work in the comedy business, and of course, they're businessmen and women as well. Are they sympathetic to what's going on? Are they afraid? I mean, what was the sense you got from them and talking to them? I mean, obviously, you're working on a business level and making the deal. But did you get any sort of sense that they were regretful that this is where we are in a culture today, or any thoughts on that?
There was one, you know, when we had the one that was canceled in Chicago, it was the venue was actually owned by the mayor of the town. And so, you know, he canceled our show. Like, we were pretty clear that this was a problem. It had been happening. And we had even had a show canceled earlier the week in Chicago. That's how we ended up at his venue at the end anyway. And because of the political side of his life, the pressure got so overwhelming that he canceled the show while our guys were there doing sound check. And, so talk about last minute. And then what was crazy was, when we read the press the next day, or he had given an interview to the news the next day and said, I regret canceling it because no one's giving me any credit for canceling it. Like I'm still condemned now as a political figure and a community member because I even contemplated, granting an artist free speech to begin with. So he kind of had remorse. It was funny though, because I circled back around with him to book another artist this year. And he was like, unless I get an apology from you. And I was like, an apology from me? We're not the one who, like, you cost us tens of thousands of dollars by pulling that stunt. We should have sued you. We didn't.
I'm laughing, and it's farcical, but it's also wildly inappropriate because these are real issues. This is your livelihood. These are other comedians who are trying to make a living these days. But let's switch to Goliath, your new comedy special. And I have to say, I've got a pretty thick skin. I grew up in Howard Stern. I watch a lot of raucous comedy. And this one got me a few times. I mean, it's both funny, but it's really got some tough subject matter. You pull no punches. How would you describe the special?
Yeah, I think the word that we used in the blurb was incendiary, and it's kind of funny because there are at the core of my comedy style it's observational. It's just my observations are much darker than somebody like a Jerry Seinfeld or a Jim Gaffigan. So, I sort of have always seen the world through the lens of like, here are the worst things in society. What's funny about that? Yeah. And I really tried to put together an hour of my observations just about what are the absolute worst things that we see in our society that are unexplainable, or maybe they are explainable, but nobody has the courage to be curious about them. And, what's funny about them to me, and can I share that with other people?
Yeah. When you're dealing with some subjects, the N-word, trans issues, does it take longer to kind of craft those bits because there are landmines there? You're trying to kind of weave in and out of certain things. Is it a challenge for you as a comedian to bring the humor out of that?
Yeah, but I think that is the challenge of learning how to become a good comedian, right? Is it's and I think you sort of see how not sharp a lot of mainstream comedians are these days because they're not touching on anything that requires you to get really, really good at it. So, I mean, when you have controversial ideas, just how you set up a bit is critical. Like if you don't set it up right, like my favorite line in the special is in the bit when I'm talking about transgender people being concerned about retaliation after the Nashville school shooting. My presentation is like, what are we going to do to you that's worse than what you want to do to you? And so by presenting it in that way, you're allowing the audience to go, yeah, that kind of is a good point. I mean, this is what could possibly be worse than that? Because to a person who doesn't have that in their mind, that sounds pretty horrific, right? So it's really about trying to simplify it and also come up with a way where it's digestible and almost sort of an undeniable argument around the bit that it forces people to acknowledge that there's some truth there, whether they necessarily agree with it or not.
Yeah, I mean, that's the interesting thing. I think some of the best comedians out there, some of the work you do, Dave Chappelle, they challenge me. And sometimes I don't agree with what you're saying, or I don't agree with the punchline perhaps. But then I think, oh, I didn't see it that way. So even if I ultimately don't share a point of view, I'm reevaluating it in my mind, which I think is one of the most fascinating things a comedian can do. Is that part of your mission, to kind of wake people up, shake people up in a sense?
Yeah, I think a lot of people assume that that's a premeditated thing on my part. It's really not. I really just try to be honest about how I see things and what I think is funny about things. And sometimes that doesn't always work. Like one of the interesting things is, because of the way my life has gone in the last 6 years, I've cultivated a far more right-leaning conservative audience. That doesn't mean that I don't have criticisms of a lot of things that people on the right support. So for instance, there's a joke where there's a lot cut out in the special because it didn't work in front of a conservative audience as well as the rest of the bit. But I still left the core message in there was, when I'm talking about the school shooting thing, I criticize the fact that the police don't get involved enough when something is happening. And that was a longer piece. And I didn't want to cut it entirely because I felt like it would have been intellectually dishonest for how I really feel about it. But there was a lot of turn in the audience from that bit that night because, you know, the conservative perspective is, you know, back the blue no matter what. And it's like, that doesn't mean police don't deserve criticism too.
Yeah. You know, I think we've seen that in recent years where, you know, conservatives like to blame the snowflakes and the going to your safe spaces. But there are a lot of people on the right who don't want to hear the Trump jokes or don't want to hear jokes that challenge them as well. It's not a good state of affairs on either side, but the fact that it's creeping up on the right is disappointing as well. You know, it's funny. I find a lot of people that I talk to through the show, it could be pop culture examiners, it could be people like you, comedians, seem like you're right of center, but often it's just about rejecting the radicalism on the left and also just being a free speech guy or gal. So I find that fascinating. Do you care about the political scene, or do you care about the individual issues and kind of let the chips fall where they may?
Yeah, I guess we'd have to get really into what do you mean in terms of the political scene. I think I am pretty invested in the political scene. I try to do a lot of stuff with Brandon Strach's Walkaway. I've done, you know, I did his roast at the end of the year last year, which was a ton of fun. And I've spoken at several of their events now and did a fundraiser with him in Beverly Hills, I think back in February or somewhere in there, February or March. But so I'm pretty politically active, but I'll tell you, Brandon and I talk about this all the time where, you know, it's kind of strange that we almost feel as politically homeless today as we did, you know, back in 2016, which caused a lot of people to vote for Donald Trump. And it's sort of like because the extremes have now ballooned on both sides, right? To where there's sort of like this liberal approach that like identity is more important than values, right? And I talk about that a lot in the special and how these are just labels and we shouldn't be judging people based on these labels, good or bad. And then on the right, it's almost like there's this what I think what caused Reagan conservative values to be kind of like that's what kind of created the left was this puritanical pearl clutching self-righteousness that happens now on the right. And you're seeing it with you know, for the last 4 years, the right has been like, now we're the party of free speech. And then people start to criticize Israel or criticize America's foreign policy. And then there's just as much puritanical pearl clutching and censorship happening now on the right as there is on the left. And so it's interesting to me how it is sort of this seesaw thing. And I would love for us to get to a point in this country where both of those things can exist, but we don't have to pick. And it doesn't always have to be the seesaw of radicalism. We can go, hey, there's some good ideas over here. There's some good ideas over there. And maybe we should try to run our country in a way that allows all of those ideas to live and breathe. And they don't actually have to become policy for the idea to be able to be discussed.
Yeah, it's a great point. You know, this is a question I feel like it's a cliched question, but I think given the work that you do, it merits inclusion. Are there topics you don't touch, go near? I mean, it feels like you're as brave as any comedian on the planet right now. But are there subjects where either you're not intrigued by them or you thought, I just can't find the funny there?
Yeah, there's never been, I don't think I've ever encountered a situation where I've wanted to write a joke and couldn't find funny in it. For me, the real challenge now becomes, how do I avoid trying to pander, right? I think the biggest problem with a lot of sort of newly conservative or conservative convert comedians, like you see people like, and this is not I don't say this as a diss, but like people like Jeff Dye or Jamie Kennedy or even Jim Brewer, who people are kind of realizing they're conservatives or it's becoming more of a part of their act now than it ever was before. I think the challenge for people like us and like them is not to pander to this new audience who's coming to you because of the amount of scarcity that they feel like they have in terms of options on the menu. And so yeah, the brave part, the hard part is being willing to tell them something they don't want to hear as well, even though they are your new audience and they could be your new evangelicals and your new supporters and loyalists. Sometimes, to be true to yourself as an artist, you have to ignore the desire. Like I have strong opinions about abortion. I just didn't write anything about abortion for this special. And so I could have held it and been like, I have to write an abortion joke, but I didn't feel compelled to. So my process is really to try to be as organic as possible with what draws my interest. And I think that'll make the material better, and not to try to check these boxes for what I think the audience might want.
I mean, I think that was a very eloquent way of describing Clapter, and you could be guilty of it on the right and the left. You know, when you think about what you've been through, you were officially or unofficially canceled. I think it was 2018 with something you said, a quip on social media. You know, you're not going to be on the Tonight Show couch anytime soon. And I think a lot of comedians who are rising up who don't have your experience would say, well, I don't want to do that. I want to avoid that. But is there hope for people who don't play by the rules? I mean, I know I'm sure you've faced a lot of punishment. You've had a lot of issues in your career that are atypical, but can you say there is a light at the end of the tunnel, that there is that there is an audience out there for being, working outside the box?
No, I wouldn't dare lie to people and tell them that there's a reason for hope. What I will say is that as an artist, you have to decide what's really in your heart and what you care about and who you want to be. Yeah. And I'll tell you that regardless of whether or not, perfect example is the most eyes I've ever had on me in my career has been when I had a TV show on the Food Network. And those people were impressed by my fame at the time or my notoriety at the time, but they didn't really appreciate who I was as a person because they had no idea who that was. Right. My currency in life, the thing I think is the most valuable, is interacting with people. And I think like listening to people, having conversations with people, entertaining each other, sharing perspective is the greatest kind of wealth you can get in the world. And I think if you look at the world that way, you'll be able to do whatever you want because you won't be worried about the monetary success or the notoriety or anything else. So what I'll say is, while my number of fans are much smaller than maybe I potentially would have had if I stayed more mainstream, the quality of the fans that I have today is something I could have only ever dreamed of or asked for. So I would rather do a show for 30 people who I can have an incredible discussion with after the show than 10,000 people who will leave and not even care about the guy they just saw, and they won't even think about it after the show.
That's a great point. And it's something, I think that the internet age is allowing us to connect with those fan bases, even if they're smaller, they're passionate, they care about you, and they get you, which is obviously most important. When you think about comedy, a few years ago, Shane Gillis was canceled from SNL. Then they made him host the show. Joe Rogan's going to have a live special on Netflix, I believe, next month. There are comedians like Louis C.K. officially canceled, who actually did something pretty lousy, and now he's selling out Madison Square Garden. Do you get the sense that from a comedian's point of view, this stranglehold on speech is lessening? It's getting better. We're getting more accepting. I mean, I still think you throw the kind of sharp elbows that we're not ready for yet in the mainstream. Yeah. It just is what it is. But do you get a sense that maybe it's getting better across the landscape than it was maybe 5 years ago?
Yeah, I don't know if it's better. I'll tell you, I think audiences are hitting peak frustration. They're hitting peak frustration with the cowardice behind a lot of art, where they're just like, nobody's actually trying to say anything. Yeah. And so I think they'd rather you try and miss than not try. And so that's why I think my audiences have been a little more forgiving and allowed me to work on some things that maybe put them in uncomfortable places. Because they're just so happy that somebody's even making the attempt anymore. Yeah. And, you'll hear these things from companies like Netflix. Like Netflix will renew Dave Chappelle, or they'll give him a new bunch of specials, or, they'll have somebody like Rogan do a live thing. And Shane is somebody I love. I think Shane has more natural funny in him than maybe anybody we've seen in our lifetime yet, my generation. Like he is undeniable, John Candy, Bill Murray, Chevy Chase, like these guys that were funny in anything you put them in the 80s. Like we haven't had a guy like that for a long time. And I think that's Shane. I think the difficulty for a guy like Shane in that is, how far do you want to have opinions that might push some of those people away from loving you just being the funniest guy? And so, even though they're sort of letting somebody like Shane back in, so to speak, into the club, I think he still has to fight the temptation to be divisive in any way. And I definitely know that the people in the industry are saying, listen, we don't want to be woke anymore, but like, don't be stupid. Don't do anything that could cost us money. And I think, or cost you money. Right. And so knowing the financial burden of getting canceled and having to deal with that, and canceled is like, the concept is kind of dumb because you have to decide if you're going to give up. But canceled is real in the sense that like when all your pitch meeting goes away and your agency drops you and there's kind of a general understanding that no one who works in this business is going to work with you, you have to figure it out. Yeah. And so when you're a guy like Shane and you claw your way back to the top after having done that once, do you really want to go through it again? And so I think the temptation for artists to self-censor is the next wave of sort of cancel culture problem in art, is that they're going to come back to us with the money and say, listen, we were wrong. We went too woke. But now that we're giving you this money, are you sure you want to do that? And we have to fight that devil on the shoulder of like, don't just take the easy money and compromise your principles.
Yeah. I'd be remiss not to ask you about this, because in the last few days, we've seen late night comedians basically do a 180 about President Biden. They were defending him. They were saying he's perfectly fine. Yes, he's old. Yes, he's slow, but he is sharp of mind. And all the things you're hearing about are not true. They had to basically say it's all true, admit it. Colbert was maybe the most shocking example of the switcheroo. Do you get the sense that their followers may be shaken by that though people have been watching Colbert for 3 years, believing a certain narrative that he was pushing forward? Now, on one day, he just basically, takes the rug out of under their feet. Does that impact their relationship with their audience, or is it politics to the end?
Unfortunately, I don't think so. I think anybody that was kind of hip to the fact that, his mental capacity and his acuity was declining, was well aware of that, and well aware that the media was carrying a bullshit torch to kind of, promote this idea that he had his faculties about him. I mean, my grandmother had Alzheimer's when I was a young boy. I know what that face is. And he's been making that face for about 6 years now. That sort of lost, scared, I don't quite know where I am or who these people are face. Yeah. And so I think most of the people who knew that was all BS tuned out from people like Colbert a while ago. I don't know if you watched the debate. I watched it. But more startling than the debate was listening to the people who called in to CNN afterwards. And the people who were falling for the Joe Biden is still fine are not going to stop supporting him anytime soon. Like the problem was, even though the news appears to be having this revelation, which I think is not genuine. I think this is a plan. I think they were going to stick by him until they decided they weren't going to stick by him. And that's why the tune changed. They didn't just realize the guy is losing his mind. They decided they no longer want him to run. And I think they know it's because he's going to get creamed. I don't know that anybody in the cabinet, to open up and replace him with is going to be any better. And that's kind of the political fight on the left right now. But the concerning thing about listening to those people is, it was almost like they didn't even see it. They were just like, well, I still can't imagine voting for Trump under any circumstance. I mean, he could be, at least there was somebody who called in and said, at least he's not in a wheelchair. As if that's the concern, right? I would rather have a sharp cat in a wheelchair than a guy who's like, who's that? Oh, it's the president of another country that we're here to see.
I think it might have been Bill Maher who said that he would vote for Biden's head in a jar over Trump. But
listen, he did. He said I would. Yes, he did. I would vote for his head in a jar with blue liquid or something. I think he meant barbicide, which is a weird, I don't think that preserves severed heads, although, I would definitely not claim to know that it doesn't, Yeah.
Well, Josh, I really appreciate being on the show. The new special is Goliath. You can find it on YouTube. You can go to joshdennycomedy.com to find out podcast information, touring dates, anything else that's going on in your world. I really appreciate the work you do. you're not the rich and famous, the elites, the Colberts. I'd so much rather have you on the show than Stephen Colbert. It's not even close. So I appreciate the work, and keep it up. And let's keep fighting for free speech. At the end of the day, these are just jokes, man. They're just jokes. And if we can't handle jokes, then we have a bigger problem than going to a comedy club. So thanks again for your time.
Hey, thank you. I appreciate it.
Well, that's it for the show this week. Thank you again to Radio America for having me as part of their great podcast lineup. And of course, if you get the chance, you have a spare moment in between washing the dishes, taking the dog out, putting their kids to bed, check out HollywoodInToto.com. I update it 7 days a week. It is 10 years old this year. I started it in 2014. And the website, like this show, is the right take on entertainment. It's not woke. It favors free speech, doesn't play by the rules. But of course, I also don't share rumors. I don't name call. I'm not dismissive. Trying to be like a journalist, an old school journalist, not the ones who are working today, the ones who get the job done. Trying my best. You can always keep me honest. Send me a message at Christian@HollywoodInToto.com. We'd love to get your feedback. And of course, thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And I'll see you next time.